Salutations and welcome to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander F., and today on the podcast, we are so excited to welcome author, practitioner of Pagan Sacramental Gnosticism, and martial artist, Craig Williams. I first had the pleasure of meeting Craig and hearing him speak earlier this summer at the Ezekiel Bates Masonic Lodge in Massachusetts, and I was immediately impressed by his sincerity, his spiritual discipline, and his willingness to share his insights with others. Now, Craig is a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine, the Vedic sciences, Gnostic spirituality, and the martial arts, and in this podcast, we discuss Craig's latest tome, Entering the Desert, Pilgrimage into the Hinterlands of the Soul, which is published by Anathem Publishing, and we also talk about what Pagan Sacramental Gnosticism means and how this kind of spiritual investigation can help open up doorways into the inner sanctuary of sacramental vision. We also talk about the importance of stripping away delusions and what it means to pursue an authentic spiritual path. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Craig Williams. Craig Williams, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, man. I had such a great time lecturing with you at the Ezekiel Bates location, and it's a real honor to be back talking to you right now.
It was such a fantastic honor to hear you speak, and the message that you had was both rejuvenating. It was refreshing to hear, especially in today's spiritual climate where there seems to be so much inauthenticity. So it was so great to hear you speak. So,
thank you so much,
Craig. Can you first just share with our listeners a little bit, who may not be too familiar, a little bit about your background and how you arrived on your current spiritual path?
Sure. I mean, I'm a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, and Gnosticism in general, and my background is typically more in Eastern sciences, so with a background in studies of Vedic sciences, Chinese philosophy, and Hinduism. And then I also have a lot of background study in mystical aspects of such as Gnosticism, types of pagan practices, which I find really fascinating. So I kind of integrate those two together. And then I'm also a medical practitioner. And so I'm really fascinated with how esoteric sciences overlap with the physical body and the physical world. And I think the perfect expression of that is something which I call tantric physics. And that's just a way that we use the body and all the senses in our direct engagement with the world in some way to literally embody our practices. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell. We can talk about any of those aspects at all tonight that you're interested in.
Craig's also the author of Cave of the Numinous Tantric Physics Volume 1, and Craig's written numerous articles on health, martial arts, and authentic initiation in Kali Yuga. But your latest book, Craig, though, Entering the Desert, specifically is about revealing a primordial kind of vision of a pagan sacramental Gnosticism. And many of our listeners, this is an occult-themed podcast, so many might be familiar with traditional Gnosticism or Gnostic ideas, and some people out there might be familiar with traditional pagan ideas or practices, but it sounds like for pagan sacramental Gnosticism, this is a very unique concept that you introduced in the book. Can you just talk a little bit about what is pagan sacramental Gnosticism?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that question, because it is a little bit of a strange technicality. And I think, back when I was in one of my undergraduate degrees was in religious studies, and I focused on Hinduism, and then I focused on Gnosticism. And back a long time ago when I was in school, when I was a young man, Gnosticism was kind of new in its, the Nag Hammadi texts had just been discovered, and the scholars were looking it over. And Gnosticism was kind of lumped into some type of quasi-mystical Christianity. And on examining of the text, I was lucky enough to be in school at that time, so I had access to a lot of the initial Nag Hammadi translations. And many of those were absolutely not Christian at all. And so I found that really fascinating. They were definitely some type of mystical tradition, but nothing what we would typically call Christianity by any kind of comparison. So I became fascinated with that in and of itself. I think over time now, when people hear Gnosticism, they tend to think of some type of body-hating, dualistic light and darkness kind of expression. And there are definitely some important teachings with that. But I have to make a very important statement and say that when I talk about Gnosticism and the Gnosticism which I present in Entering the Desert, it's a very body-positive Gnosticism. It's a Gnosticism which does not see the world as a prison. It's a Gnosticism which does not see the body as a prison. Actually, quite the opposite. And so a pagan sacramental Gnosticism is kind of a heretical use of the apostolic succession in a magical way to use that almost as a type of magical tool to empower us in our own explorations of the soul. And so I am an ordained Gnostic bishop with apostolic succession, but I would absolutely not refer to myself as a Christian. And I think most Christians who have apostolic succession might be uncomfortable with how I use the apostolic succession, but to me, it's a magical technique. We can see the apostolic succession as some type of ancient esoteric transmission of some type of primordial teaching, which is kind of filtered down through different systems. So during Entering the Desert, I kind of saw that as some way to express a type of Gnosticism that was not what people typically see as some kind of Christian Gnosticism. There wasn't any really expression of that. Most people who call themselves a Gnostic priest or a Gnostic bishop, when I would meet them, they would just be basically quasi-mystical Christians, which I personally don't have any problem with. That's fine. I respect all those people. But I felt there was something lacking. And I definitely saw ways that I was using my Gnostic ordination in different ways that they weren't using the apostolic succession as a type of magical energy, which we can definitely get into with your background, with doing ritual magic and more kind of communicating with spirits and having that be some type of empowerment. So I wanted to kind of express that in the book Enter the Desert, and that's how the desert actually has a grimoire in there as well, too. So that might be something we can talk about as well. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a viewpoint into that. But please ask more questions if I was confusing there at all.
In Entering the Desert, can you talk about the power of non-dualism? Because that seems to be something that you're offering the readers, to offer them to take a journey with you through the desert to say, hey, everything, there's this totality, this kind of non-local totality that is just there, and it's free from all of the shackles of dualism. Can you talk about that?
You know, my metaphor of the desert was definitely a multi-layered metaphor, but on a most fundamental level, it was an expression of the journey into the desert was a metaphor, or is a metaphor, the journey into the soul. And so I see our experience of the soul, particularly from an Eastern perspective, and definitely from a pagan perspective. The soul is not something that is damaged or needs to be saved. The soul in and of itself is already perfect. What we typically need to do is clear out any kind of blockage or obfuscations to our direct experience of the soul. And that's typically, when we talk about the word Gnostic or gnosis, when I talk about it, it means a direct, unmediated experience with the numinous or something beyond, whether people want to call that the numinous, God, greater force, source of being. They can pick their certain verbiage. But in the desert book, I wanted it to show that everyone has to take that journey. Everyone has to take the journey into the soul if they really wish to truly have a type of self-realization that is an empowerment and that is also a liberation from the shackles of dualism. And that's obviously definitely influenced by my studies in Advaita Vedanta and Tantric physics as well. However, I wanted the book Entering the Desert to be something which was free of... I find that, when I wrote Cave of the Numinous, and which I am very proud of, and that was Tantric Physics Volume 1, and in 2018 I'll release Tantric Physics Volume 2. and I would consider myself a Vedic practitioner. However, I think a lot of people are intimidated by Sanskrit. They're intimidated by Eastern systems. They didn't grow up with that. They see it as kind of exotic, and it's like learning a different language, and to learn that language, or to enter that world, rather, you have to learn that language. I wanted the desert book to be something where literally people had no excuse to not access it, right? Then I made that point in the book. I'm not using Sanskrit. I'm not using any other type of language. I'm speaking in a direct, unmediated expression of that soul experience. And so that was why I wanted to kind of have that kind of non-dualistic approach, but not have it kind of connected to an Eastern idea. And I found that a problematic thing with much paganism. I think a lot of paganism still had those kind of tinges of dualism, and the magician had to stand in the circle, and to protect themselves from something they were calling up, or they always had to have some kind of way that they were cleansing themselves. And also, too, I found that your average practitioner of paganism or Gnosticism just didn't really have many tools of a praxis to use. So I wanted the Desert Book to be some type of expression of a type of non-dualistic practice, but also give the reader and the practitioner a kind of a skeleton of a system, which they could take into any system they were doing, whether they were a Thelemite, a practitioner of Tantra, a type of witchcraft practitioner. They could take the skeleton from entering the desert and then kind of build some type of infrastructure for their own practice. And so that's kind of where I wanted that to be. And then our expression in the soul, when we enter any kind of expression or experience with the soul, it's completely non-dualistic, and that's very frightening to the ego, and it's very frightening to a mind which is kind of locked into a very dualistic perception of reality. So, as a result, it can appear demonic, it can appear frightening, and that's where we tend to get those kind of expressions like dark night of the soul, or entering the desert to experience your temptation. So I think we have a lot of metaphors like that, and I tried to use the Desert Book as a way to kind of bring people into that, and hopefully you saw that when you read it.
You mentioned this concept about the soul, and so many people talk about the soul, especially today, being a happy place where they're never challenged, they're always happy. Absolutely. And a lot of new age philosophy, as both you and I read, seems to be really into this concept of just, light working and eternal positivism and crystals. But you're arguing something else in the book, that the soul, is that journey into the wilderness. It's a place of challenge and struggle, but ultimately the soul is the topography for spiritual victory. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about that?
That's a good point you brought up. I think the way that we tend to sell spirituality, at least in the modern or contemporary times, is that anything that is, quote, spiritual has to be nice, happy, of course, light-bearing, and anything that's not that is going to be something dark. We see this a lot in the yogic practitioners. They use the word sattvic, and they'll tend to say everything must be sattvic or pure. And I mean, if you look at your average yoga practitioner today and you read what they write and you read what they say, they're basically liberal Christians. And then they just put a machine on. That's all they are, and it's just laughable. It's a bit embarrassing for them, and then it's a bit naive to think that the world exists that way. That's why when you look at things, for example, from India, their expressions of the gods can be quite frightening. I mean, I don't think anybody would think that Kali is a happy light god. And many of the dark goddesses are, very ferocious looking. And also in Tibet, we see that, many of the gods have very demonic forms. And those typically express the idea that within the soul, everything exists. Everything is basically existing within the soul. That, like you literally just said, the soul is the topography of our entire spiritual journey. Everything we do exists within the soul. Everything is a game within the soul. It's the dice game of Shiva. And so the soul has both light and dark. There's no escaping that. And so the more someone tries to repress and kind of paint away the darkness, then it actually becomes a very dangerous force, a repressed force, and comes out in very chaotic ways, which we can clearly see in contemporary times. And we can see that the desert becomes a really good metaphor for a place where you have to go to experience all parts of the soul, both the happy parts and both the darker parts. And knowing that they're both existing in the same realm and they're both kind of balancing each other out. And that I particularly think that has really important ramifications for ritualistic magic, without a doubt, number one. But I wanted the book to understand that also has deep ramifications for psychological health, spiritual advancement, and then what a spiritual integration, for us to see that both that means not denying the body, not denying certain desires. And this is definitely, obviously, clearly linked with my work in esoteric Voodoo, which sees that as well too, as a body positive practice. So we can, those are some of the ideas I wanted to express. But even though people in the West tend to kind of, and particularly in the occult world, they tend to sometimes downplay Christianity, or they'll go to great lengths to say they're not Christians. When you look at some of their beliefs, it's still heavily influenced by Christianity, or they're defined in opposition to Christianity. And Eastern systems just don't have that. They don't have that limitation. And so I kind of wanted to express that in my expression of pagan Gnosticism doesn't have that limitation either. The soul is a place that is already fine. The soul does not need to be healed. But what we need to heal is our perception of reality. And we need to unblock any kind of roadblocks we have to our direct, unmediated experience of the soul through the physical body. We're not seeking to escape the physical. We're not seeking to escape the world. We're not looking for some fantastical heaven or a golden age where there's no wars and no sickness and everyone's equal, and that we don't look for that. We just look for our direct experience in the body, and then kind of removing the roadblocks to do that. And in order to do that requires a system, some type of practice. And so I tried to outline a basic idea of that in Entering the Desert. As well, I think that to do that requires some type of esoteric practice where we have direct contact with intelligences not from this realm. And that's where we can get into some of the subject matter, if you like, as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, I remember you mentioned when you were speaking with Greg Kaminsky on the occult of personality, where you actually warn against the dangers of surgically separating yourself from your quote-unquote spiritual world and the quote-unquote mundane life, which I think is a trap that so many people I know I've fallen into it, where it's like, okay, what I'm doing here in the circle or doing some kind of ritual, that's the ritual, and then I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go, get some Cheetos and drink a Pepsi, and that's not holy. That's not part of the ultimate reality. And so can you kind of talk, Greg, about, does Entering the Desert help show the readers how to bridge that gap between what is perceived as spiritual and the quote unquote mundane world?
Yeah, I mean, that's, to me, is one of the biggest problems that the majority of people I see have, is they exist in a completely bifurcated existence. And they have one clear part of their life, which is kind of this idealistic spiritual realm, which they kind of expect to make everything better. They kind of expect it to make everything happy. And then they have this other mundane world, which they're always struggling in, and they're struggling against certain desires they want or certain limitations. And then my perception of at least my pagan sacramental Gnosticism sees, there should be an intimate relationship with both. The mundane world and the spiritual world should be intimately linked. And everything we do in our life, literally every action, everything we do, should be an embodiment of our entire spiritual practice. And so to do that requires a pretty radical shift in how we see reality, a radical shift in how we see the world. And it definitely means that we don't seek to escape from the world. Rather, it means that we have to immerse ourselves in the world. And that's a very frightening concept for a lot of people, particularly as now people tend to see the world as a crazy place or a chaotic place. But the world has always been crazy and chaotic. And there's never going to be a magical time. The more we repress the spiritual and we push it aside, the more we kind of keep that kind of bifurcated reality between the mundane and the spiritual, the more people start living in these kind of delusional states where they start wanting more and more escapism. And we see that now with people, like, they want escapism through artificial intelligence. They want escapism through technology, through the media. and all these things that are happening, and which are a clear connection of our, what I like to term, it's a clear connection of our alienation from the soul. You know, the more we're connected to the soul, the more we'll be connected to the earth, to nature, to creativity, and those are all things that we're actively kind of removing ourselves from in the contemporary world. So, you can see that throughout Entering the Desert. It's a kind of a radical statement against the abuse of technology, against the abuse of the senses, against the abuse of language, and then to try to get people to understand that they must start to see their experience of everyday life as a chance for them to get really, really important glimpses of ways the soul is speaking to them, because the soul is always with us. We exist within the soul. Like you said, that is the topography of the soul. So if they're completely immersed in artificial stimulation, artificial images, artificial food, artificial sound, artificial light, artificial lifestyle, then they're always going to be blocked to that voice of the soul. And so you can see many times in Entering the Desert, I talk about going back to nature, returning to nature, rituals in nature, and awakening. That important term in the book, which you mentioned, is what I refer to as sacramental vision. And sacramental vision is a type of awakening of an esoteric vision that we all have within us. But to do this, we have to literally kind of awaken that voice of the soul within us that is always there, but we have to awaken our ability to listen to it. And we can't listen to that voice of the soul if we're always immersed in an artificial environment. So I think that's one of the most important concepts of the book, is that we must return to some type of exposure to nature and natural images, natural sound, natural light. And so in the book, I outlined a practice, a way that people can start to orient their daily life, orient how they eat, orient how they sleep, without living some kind of monastic escapism. There might be periods of that, but it's a realistic book in the sense that this is something that everyone has access to. This isn't anything that is keeping any certain secrets away from people.
Absolutely. And there's so many different things that I definitely want to get into, the concept of the cell and the mirage and the desert grimoire. Right. Before we get to that, Craig, one of the interesting ways that you structured the book, and aside from the very high quality illustrations and the grimoire notes that visually carry kind of a gravity of their own, you actually mention in the book about, how when you write chapters with this kind of melodic, thematic point making, almost like a word woven raga, where there are these notes, so to speak, of specific important points that you repeat and elaborate on to kind of hit the reader in an impactful way, even sometimes when he or she isn't really expecting it. So can you kind of elaborate on this thematic, almost musical like structure, and why you wrote the book like that?
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you picked that up. And I mentioned, in the introduction, I tried to mention a little bit of that, is that I truly see writing as a magical act. And so I see the ability of writing and the ability of word to be a type of magical practice. And so I wanted the Desert Book to be something which was not only filled with content, which was important, but also to have a conveyance of those words in a way which would be multi-layeral, multi-textual, and that would kind of hit the reader at different levels. And so the book it's very layered, and then each time you read it, you'll see something else can pop out depending on your perception of it. And then that was definitely influenced by my love of Indian music and the raga, which has a central theme and then certain kind of loops of different notes come and go, almost like types of bubbles kind of coming up in water and then re-sinking back down on waves. And so that's kind of how I wanted to express that in the book. So the book actually kind of creates a certain atmosphere of its own, so that when you read the book, you read the chapters, it can start to actually kind of create a certain kind of mind space. And then when that happens, certain concepts can bypass the surface mind and kind of penetrate into a deeper level, which is a type of magical practice. So and that's where the grimoire aspect of the book, there's actually a hidden grimoire within the book, within the grimoire. And so the more people read it, the more they open up to it, the more they do the rituals, they'll start to see that over time. And so I'm really glad you picked that up. And so I worked very hard to make that part of the structure of the book. So,
Craig, to that point, why don't we go through just briefly some of the different themes and the concepts in the book, because I think that our listeners especially could really benefit from applying a lot of the concepts. And one of the first things that you introduce in the book is almost like a thing to watch out for. Instead of giving material, you introduce this concept of the mirage.
Yes.
And especially, you just touched on this, like in today's modern spiritual / new age / occult communities, a lot of people, sometimes you might see someone making a post or doing something and you're like, are you sure you need a grimoire? Maybe you just need a therapist. Can you, Craig, just kind of talk about when you are entering the desert, when you're initiating this powerful journey that you delineate in the book, what is the mirage? What is the main illusory aspect that someone might encounter when they first begin this journey into the desert?
The concept of the mirage was something which I felt was a fundamental topic to address at the beginning of the book, because it's basically saying that you really have to question all the beliefs that you hold. And that's what most people don't do. Most people, a spiritual practice should be, a true spiritual practice, in my opinion, should be a deconstruction of our reality. And it should be something which deconstructs our conditioned beliefs. It should deconstruct and challenge what we hold true, because most of the things we hold true are just kind of like quasi-memories, societal conditioning, things our schooling or parents told us, or maybe things a certain kind of old spiritual practice told us. And most people, even who fight against certain beliefs, are still defined by them in subconscious ways. And I felt that the idea of the mirage was very good metaphor for people to understand this, because the mirage seems so real, right? That's the thing. And they look at something and they see like, oh, that must be there. But then when they arrive there, it's nothing. It's just an illusion. And so I wanted to use that as initially as a metaphor for them to just examine any kind of beliefs they have. But I also felt it was very important because the modern obsession with artificial intelligence and computers and technology, where everything is just easily manipulated, and people are obsessed with visual mirages as well too. So so they're kind of easily manipulated via advertising, via media outlets, and so I wanted that to be an idea that those are all mirages as well. So it's kind of a multi-layered concept. We have a personal mirages, we have psychological mirages, and most importantly, we have societal mirages. And then I feel the most dangerous mirage is the spiritual mirage, because people hold their spiritual mirages so close they think that those are the safe ones they never want to look at. And so I think we have to look at that as well, too. So I wanted people to say that before they go to any experimental practices, before they go in any kind of experimental work on the spiritual level, they really have to examine what they hold true, what they believe, and see if that is something which really is something which is important to them, and also something which is reasonable, and also something which they're kind of embodying as well too. And from a very esoteric aspect, it boggles my mind to hear people think that they can contact some kind of, universe B, grimoire aspect, qliphothic entities just at the drop of a hat, yet they can't kind of understand, they can't deal with Facebook, or they can't deal with breakup of a girlfriend, or they can't deal with the stress of their job, but yet they think their consciousness can withstand being in the realm of something from another dimension or another kind of intelligence. And it's just laughable to me. So if someone does really want to communicate with transmundane intelligences, they better have everything in order psychologically and spiritually. It's a kind of a crass metaphor, but it's a different analogy of saying like someone who maybe like takes martial arts, but they've never really been in a fight. And then they think, oh, well, I'm really good. I've been going to class all the time, and they get in a real fight and nothing works. Or they don't realize that what getting hit feels like. or how serious it means. And then they realize, oh, wow, so that's a big thing. So I think that if someone does wish to, go deeper into their practices, the deeper that one goes into a spiritual practice without dismantling the mirages, the more dangerous it becomes. And it's like a virus, because the virus infects you and you don't even know you're infected. That's the point. Most people don't even know what the mirage is. That's because the mirages are that good. We have personal mirages, but then we have societal mirages. So then we have a meta mirage. It's like layered mirage on mirage on mirage on top. And then there's no hope for most of those people to get out of that. And so most spiritual practices should be something which is kind of dangerous. It should be something which is breaking down those type things. And that's why so many practitioners of spiritual systems are seen as demonic. They're seen as dangerous. They're seen as antinomian, radical figures, because in many ways they have to be. And I was, the Desert Book was deeply influenced by some particular desert journeys in Tibet. And in Tibetan shamanism, there's definitely, they'll use very demonic images to fight off demonic powers or to empower themselves. And so that's also, they use those images to fight off our inner demons, the psychological demons, the things we hold true as well. And you see this clearly in the modern occult world. There's this new fascination with psychology, right? They want to say, like, well, it's really psychological perception. And so we have all these new occultists or old occultists kind of embracing Carl Jung. But yet I don't even see any of these people actually even reading Carl Jung or even knowing what Carl Jung actually taught. So it's kind of ironic with that. And then they try to psychologize the experiments. And I think that's quite dangerous. We have two very important things which you talked about. Most of the people just need a therapist. I absolutely agree. But also, too, now people are kind of using psychology as their own God and say, well, I don't need spiritual practice. I have psychology, or the psychology kind of protects me. The demons aren't really real. They're just metaphors for my higher self. And those are like ultimate mirages that our modern society loves to embrace to protect them from actually facing the reality of communication with some type of intelligence which is not of this realm, which can be quite dangerous and empowering in both. These mirages exist on so many levels. And so that's kind of just something I wanted to touch on in the book. So I think people really have to start examining that.
There's this reductionism that's going on that just kind of shatters any hope that you would have of engaging in meaningful spiritual experience, which is exactly what you try to get the readers to understand in the book.
Exactly. My mention of the word Gnostic or Gnosis of being a direct, unmediated experience, it's not going to come through psychology, and it's not going to come through the other. There's basically two, golden calves in the occult world right now. One is psychology. They want to turn everything into psychology. And the other thing is, quote, academic. There's this new fetishization of being like academic, or they want occult conferences to be academic. And so they somehow feel like that if something is a book and like academic, then it's more important or more real than something else. And that's a direct reflection of their fear of the soul. It's another direct reflection of their fear of direct, unmediated expression of the actual occult experience. And so we're seeing that more and more. And they're using that as basically ways to just kind of sanitize, to homogenize, and to attempt to control something which is uncontrollable and chaotic. No matter how much you try to be academic or psychological about demons or other types of intelligence, eventually you're going to run out of paper and room, and then you're just going to have to face the reality. And I think that that's something that, needs to be discussed more today. And I say that coming from an academic background. I've went into academic studies, and I've seen that, and it was kind of laughable. So
you mentioned this concept of the cell and about creating the environment and light and space and all of these different elements. So can you for someone out there who's listening saying, okay, I'm with Craig up to this point, I get that I got a lot of internal emptying to do, and now I feel like I've gotten to a point where I've stripped myself to this kind of unvarnished, kind of brutal, honest, approach. What do I do now? And this is where the cell comes in. So what is the cell about?
Yeah, the cell for me was kind of a important metaphor of personal practice. And that's another thing I see that is very problematic in the occult world and the Gnostic world, was people they're just book collectors. They're just, the occult world, their practices become a kind of a social club, or just collecting books. And they have all the books. They don't read the books, but they have them on their shelf. And they'll have all the instruments, they'll have everything, they'll have all the memes, they'll have all the, the things, but they don't really do anything. So when you ask them, first of all, like, well, can we discuss the books? Well, no, they really haven't read them. Or tell me what your daily practice is. They don't really have a practice. And so the cell is a space, the cell is a place where someone would go to do their daily practice. And so in that chapter, The Cell, I try to outline how important it is to start creating an environment, both in your mind but also in your living space, to have a space where you go to study, and to do that alone. That's not something you do with others. That becomes your own personal journey of something that you're learning and growing. You might have a teacher. That's what we often see even in the desert kind of monastic tradition. They would have a certain Abba or father or mother that the students would be around, and then after they would have a teaching, the student or the teacher would say, now go back to your cell and ponder this or contemplate this. And so that there's an isolationism. The cell is basically a reflection of what I refer to as a type of Gnostic isolation, where someone has to just do the work. That's like years and years and years of personal exploration, writing, studying, contemplating, discussing ideas, going back and pondering on them, meditation, private ritual work, basically just all the dirty work. And that means actual living it, doing it. And so the cell was a space where that happened. So within that cell chapter, I try to outline some very important aspects of that so that people would have the tools to do that. So that regardless of whatever tradition they had, they could read that chapter and start to see how, specific ways they could start to orient their day, orient how they live, orient how they sleep, orient how they even eat and think, just to start kind of giving themselves a chance to kind of back away from that manipulated world they're living in. So hopefully that kind of showed through.
If the mirage, kind of stripping that away, creates this kind of spiritual space, the cell gives you that physical realm to kind of move in. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, without a doubt. At some point, people are going to have to do some type of practice. And I think that's also another thing which is implicated in that chapter in The Cell, is eventually, if somebody wants to make progress in their spiritual journey, they're going to have to pick something and stick with it consistently and work it, regardless of what that system is, and then they can't just keep jumping around to different things. And so the cell was a place where they were dedicated to something, dedicating time to create the specific environment. I use the idea in the book of atmospheres, to creating certain atmospheres that we have to create to do that. And so that kind of chapter starts to give people the tools to allow that to happen.
Picking a system, a grimoire, and sticking with it, and not getting discouraged if at first, you don't amazingly succeed and, attain all 9 levels of consciousness. So can you, Craig, share, especially someone at your level, can you share maybe earlier on your spiritual journey, can you talk about a time or a general theme where you started something, you worked it, and you did experience that kind of, well, nothing's happening, or maybe there's a failure, and then pushing through that? Did you ever experience that?
Yeah, I think for me, my magical practice, my esoteric journey was deeply influenced by my lifetime study of martial arts. So I was very, lucky to be really interested in martial arts as a child. So I kind of grew up in that culture, and that is just something that just takes a lot of time and a lot of work. You don't progress quickly in anything, so you learn a lot of patience. You learn to accept failure. You learn, actually, most of all, that you learn more from failure than you learn from successes. And so I think that, to me, was something which was always behind, or in the back of my mind when I, started to really get into esoteric work, was I just expected it to be a long road. And so, but to me, the actual dirty work is what I find enjoyable. The best metaphor I can give that for most people who can understand is because, I do so much physical training for particularly like running and racing. And to me, the actual race was like, meh. I mean, it was fun. It was great. But I was more interested in all the work that you had to do to get to the race. That, to me, was enjoyable. I really liked that whole experience of that. And so, to me, without sounding cliche, the journey was more important than the destination. And so I think that attitude is very important for people to consider and to really start to contemplate when they have any kind of spiritual practice, is that everything they do in the day-to-day minutia, the work, that's where the magic really lies. That's kind of what I was kind of talking about when we want to try to avoid that bifurcation between the spiritual and the mundane realm, right? That's this idea of wanting magical things to happen all the time is a direct symptom of that bifurcation of the spiritual world and the mundane world. We know that even with our mundane life, every day is not amazing. Some days are amazing, some days aren't, some days are average, but there's still magic in those average days, and things still happen. So I think people need to understand, even with a magical practice, a spiritual practice, it just takes time. It takes time. It takes a lot of work. It takes guidance. It takes advice. It takes a system. And it takes a type of organization. You have to basically organize your life in order to succeed. So that becomes into priorities, and people have to have priorities like, how much actual time are they putting into the practice? That's what's going to happen. It's the same thing as any other thing. The more time they put into something, the more kind of benefit they're going to get from it, and they learn from it. So I think that's one of the things that people have to understand, that anything that worth accomplishing something is just going to take a lot of hard work. And I think that the spiritual manufactured kind of spiritual ideas that, that's different with spiritual stuff. Spiritual stuff just happens. You don't really have to work at it here. It's no different than anything else. If anything, it's harder, in my opinion.
Another element you discuss in the book, the importance of rituals. The ritual
Yes.
of sleep, eating. I mean, everything has this beautiful connotation that you put on it. If the journey is about this kind of, spiritual pilgrimage, this kind of desert, can you talk about, something as quote unquote simple as sleep, or something as quote unquote simple as, eating, or whatever it is? Can you just talk about why did you place so much emphasis on the importance of rituals? It's such a very beautiful way to approach stuff.
Thank you. I think that one of the biggest signs of our modern spiritual malaise and spiritual sickness is the lack of ritual. We've lost almost all rituals as a society, except for very, ersatz pop culture rituals. And then I think that, rituals are very important from an esoteric sense, because rituals allow us to create a sacred time, and rituals allow us to create a sacred space. And so that's actually the title of Volume 2 of Tantric Physics is called Sacred Body, Sacred Space. And it's about the importance of ritual in the esoteric practice. And so I think people need to see that when we say ritual, of course we mean the sacred ritual room, the ritual instruments that people might think of in ritualistic magic. Those can become very important. But if we stop that dichotomy of the mundane and the spiritual world, and we break down that wall, then we have to see that literally everything we do can become a ritualistic action. And so all of our actions have the potential to become ritualized. And so particularly, I grew up in the South, and so meal times were very important in our family. We all had to be home for dinner. And when that was happening, you couldn't skip out on that. So the day became oriented around dinner. So the dinner had this certain kind of feel to it. And, and each hour that got closer to the dinner, that you knew that was coming. And so, so I think that in my studies of Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine, we see eating as a sacred act. Most primordial cultures would see both acquiring the food as a sacred act, harvesting the food or killing the food was a sacred act, but consuming it too. And you can see that now. People just they eat while they're driving, they eat while they're watching television, they eat while they're just talking with friends. They eat just blindly doing it. And so just like small talk, people just talk without thinking what they're saying. So they've lost all aspect of the sacral, or this, kind of sacralizing their everyday action. So I kind of wanted to try to inspire people to see that with that part of the book, and for them to see that they can take any everyday action and turn it into a sacred ritual. And that, to me, is intimating the importance of the sacraments, the importance of the pagan sacraments. And even in the book, I have a pagan mass in that book that has the sacraments of the body and the blood there as well too, and those become very important images of that, of a certain type of ritual act. So, and I see as a medical practitioner, two areas that I see most people suffer from is digestive problems and eating poorly, and so they need to start to return to some type of kind of making their eating and their food sacred, and they also have sleeping problems. And we have to see sleep as a very sacred action as well, too. It's a magical act. It's a sacred act. It's a regenerative act. And so I kind of wanted to kind of put that in there as well, too. So that chapter has a lot to do about just how we have to return to ritual. We have to have some parts of our lives that become rituals. And we have to learn to see the sacred rituals that are constantly happening around us, the seasons changing, cycles of the moon, all those things, the circadian rhythms in our body, the way our heart beats, the way we breathe, all those are reflections of a type of cosmic cycles and cosmic rituals that are happening every day, every moment. So I wanted to try to awaken people that as well.
Do you think, Craig, that this kind of lack of reverence for the elements that you talk about, sleep, eating, everything, do you think that that's tied to, de-evolution into secular humanism and modernity?
Yeah.
And
oh, absolutely.
Can you kind of touch on that? Because I think there might be some listeners out there who might say, well, I enjoy, reading about magic and spiritual practices, but I also consider myself a secular humanist, and what's wrong with that? Can you kind of speak to that whole thing?
Yeah, we've totally fetishized science now too, right? People say things like, "Oh, I believe in science." I don't even know what that really means. I like to talk. I always say, like, what do you mean, like quantum physics science, Newtonian science, nuclear physics science? Most people who say that don't even have an education, even in the most basic level of science. And I think I see the current trend of secular humanism and the fetishization of science as a radical example of a primordial fear of the reality of the soul. And the more and more people start to sense that on a collective unconscious level, it's a very frightening thing, because it means a complete destruction of the reality as we know it, the fake homogenized reality, the artificial reality. And so most people, or the ego, societies, people hold that as their sacred calf. And so it's like a flame. As you get closer to a flame, you start to feel the heat. And then as the more you repress something, the more that will start to come out in really weird ways. And that's when you see that other just ridiculous phrase, "I'm spiritual but not religious." That's a big thing. I'm spiritual but not religious. I only believe in science. Those are clear examples of just this radical fear of the direct, unmediated experience of something beyond surface reality. And that's something that, they refuse to see. And so other cultures just didn't really have that as much. Some of my immersion in cultures from India and China, and my, kind of interest in magical work from Africa, those cultures just have a completely different radical viewpoint of reality. So the Western world just doesn't have that. And so as we start to lose ritual, then we start to see, like, we want to see science as the church, and that's when you also see this glorification of artificial intelligence, people thinking that computers are going to make things better, it's going to be improved, that they're going to improve humans and things like that. It's very frightening to me. I think most people don't even understand the implications, and I definitely hold a very Steinerian, Rudolf Steiner view of Ahriman, and that's influence on modernity. I didn't mention that in the Desert book because I wanted to try to keep out anything that was too technical. I do see that, the kind of forces at play is there's a cosmic expression of kind of ancient forces that are playing out, and so people will be manipulated. Most people, what they believe, what they think, what they say they think, what they say they believe, are just manufactured ideas they've been sold. That they're mirages that they've just kind of bought and sold happily too. Some people, I think we see some of those metaphors being, seeping into the, everyday things with Matrix movies and stuff like that. But these things were, like writers like Philip K. Dick and William Burroughs were talking about that way before the Matrix. I mean, I think people need to trace it back to the other quality material besides that. So
overall, can you talk, Craig, about, after introducing all of these themes in your book, what place does the Desert Grimoire serve or have for all of these concepts? What is the really important thing about this concept?
Yeah, the Desert Grimoire was something which I would say discovered in Tibet. And one of my journeys to Tibet, I had a very intense spiritual experience. And then there's an idea in Tibetan magic or Tibetan mysticism of something called a turtan, which is some type of magical, it could be a book, it could be an instrument that's existing in another realm or another dimension, and certain things change in the environment which makes the discovery of that possible. And these things could be a discovery in one's mind, it could be a discovery literally in a location, but oftentimes they're almost like some type of esoteric manifestation. And while I was at Mount Kailas on one of my trips to Tibet, I had a radical spiritual experience, and I visualized the Desert Grimoire. I could see it, I could feel it, I knew what it was going to say, and so I wrote that out, and that book actually existed for years. And then that was actually the seed of the whole book. So I built the book around that. It's almost like a sutra. These are pithy little, kind of sentences, which are highly evocative, symbolic writing, which are trying to express something which is extremely hard to express in words. And so I used poetic metaphors and a type of magical writing to express something. And then over years and time, I just took my time and worked out the other concepts from the book, from the Desert Grimoire. And I think I used the term grimoire because I felt that when I read and when I transcribed and wrote the Desert Grimoire, it changed my consciousness radically. And then I think that when people read that, my hope is that it gives them just a glimpse or a taste of something that is strange and something which is coming from another kind of perception of reality that's not on the mundane realm. And hopefully that can kind of have, I like to call it a type of Gnostic radiation, right? That can kind of like linger and seep into the body and kind of change things. And hopefully you kind of felt a little bit of that when that's including the sigils that are part of it, which kind of evoke certain kind of ideas in the mind as well.
Can you talk about the concept of the influence of alchemical forces, alchemical kind of Gnostic insights? What importance and why did you place that importance on alchemy in the book?
Yeah, I kind of saw that the idea of that, the soul is a corrosive element. I think the soul is something which in Vedic astrology, we see the sun as a malefic. Yet the sun is seen as a representation of the soul, which a lot of people get confused to that, particularly who come from like a Western background. They're like, wait a minute, the soul's supposed to be happy, it's supposed to be beautiful, and the sun's supposed to be this bringer of light, and it is, but it's also burns things, destroys things, dries things up. It's a harsh. Anyone who's been out in the sun, the desert, knows the sun's it's unrelenting, it's unforgiving. And so I think I see the soul as like that. The closer we get to the solar radiations of the soul, it literally starts to burn away things that aren't really important. And that can be very dangerous if you're not ready for it. And it can be also very uncomfortable even when you are ready for it. And so just like any transformation, I personally feel any physical, spiritual, mental, psychological, emotional, however you want to see it, that any transformation is messy. It's like a birth. There's going to be some pain involved. There's going to be some happiness, sadness, blood. Everything's mixed together. And I see ritualistic magic as the same way. And so I think that's when we see alchemy. Oftentimes alchemy is that people try to, sell it as something which is kind of poetically interesting and attractive. But, alchemy is also quite messy, can be messy. And then by experimenting and doing with it, you have to go through a lot of different processes. So I wanted the kind of the journey into the soul, the transformation of the mind as it kind of struggles to understand what soul expressions are, that all those were going to be a type of alchemical transformation, which means that we're working with corrosives. I see the instruments of pagan sacramental Gnosticism. I see the sacraments as quite corrosive. I see the sacraments as something as when someone engages in them, then it starts to burn away their delusions. It can burn away their mirages, and that can either be a good thing if you want it, or for some people it can be frightening. And I also too think that from a ritualistic magic point, that even a communication, a ritual experience with other types of intelligence can be a corrosive effect too, in a positive way and in a negative way. So depending on the mindset you go into it, so I see that ritualistic magic is an alchemical act too, if it's done in the correct way. If not, I think there's a lot of room for error, but so hopefully that makes sense too. So I think that theme of alchemy is very important to the entire book.
Can you just talk about how your book kind of has Vajrayanic fingerprints to it?
Yeah, I think that's. I'm glad you picked that up, and the use of the phrase sacramental vision is a direct expression of that, because we can use the term, although I don't use it in the book, it's very important for us to discuss it as we discuss the book, the term Maya, the Sanskrit term Maya, which means, there's some type of delusion or covering, essentially is what it means. There's a covering of reality. And so in yogic practice, Buddhist practice, and both, they would say that, once one clears out their ignorance, their avidya, then the Maya is revealed, the mirage is revealed. And so, but then also too, there's an idea in yoga, both Buddhism and Hinduism, of Shakti and then Yoga Maya, which means that once you see the illusion, then you start to realize, oh, it's an illusion, but it's something that we can create to our own advantage, or we understand that it's not real. That way we don't have to be manipulated by it anymore. We're still existing in it, but we don't have to be controlled by it as much. So for me, the sacramental vision is an expression of being able to be the artist of your own life, and to also to see all the ways that every aspect of life is expressing itself to you. Every aspect of the world has a soul, has a voice, has a radiation, has its own poetry. And we just we can't see it anymore. Most people can't see it. Most people can't hear it. Most people can't taste it. It's like learning how to taste a wine. As you learn your palate, as you educate your palate, or the nuances of your palate come out, you start to pick up a lot more that was there. The same thing in Kung Fu. You develop a certain level of kind of reflexes and perceptive ability, so that you're not overwhelmed and you can react in different ways that people perceive as magical or superhuman, but they're not. They're just you're just perceiving things in a different way. And so I think that's what I wanted to express, that once you kind of see through the mirage and you see the underlying workings of both your mind and how it interacts with consciousness, and how consciousness interacts with the world, both the mundane world and the spiritual world, then we can see that, we can start to kind of remove those dark glasses and literally see reality in a new way. And I term that in the book sacramental vision, that you can see everything as a sacrament, meaning that everything that you see, everything that you hear, everything that you taste can become something which can awaken you to your soul, if you know how to see it, if you know how to do it. If not, it could be something which kills you or destroys you, or it could just be something that just goes by and you don't even know it's there. And that's definitely influenced by, my studies in Tibet and Hinduism as well, both. But I wanted to try to convey that in a way that was not roadblocked by people who said, I don't want to read Sanskrit, I don't want to read Buddhism. This is just more kind of a direct, I use that term primordial, almost like a language or a way of expressing things before they became too complicated. So hopefully that showed through in the book. But it seems that many people are picking that up, so I'm very excited.
Entering the Desert is available at Anathema Publishing, anathemapublishing.com. And, meeting yourself and hearing you earlier this summer was great. And I also got a chance to meet the publisher, Gabriel McCrary. And Can you talk about, Craig, about Anathema Publishing and Gabriel, who is the founder of Anathema Publishing, and just kind of your relationship and how you two met and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really wonderful journey working with Anathem. And my upcoming works in 2018, which I'll have the next volume of Tantric Physics, that will be with Anathema. I'll also have an upcoming book on esoteric Voodoo, and that will also be with Anathema. I'll have a couple essays in the upcoming Pillars journal from Anathema as well, too. So we work very well together. And I mean, the thing I think I love the most about Gabriel and Anathema is they work closely with the writer, the author, to listen to what the author is trying to achieve, and then to help that writer achieve that at the highest possible level they can. And that's the best you could hope for, you know, from a publishing company. And I think the wonderful thing about Anathema is that Gabriel sees publishing as an alchemical act. And he sees, you know, every aspect of it as some way that can create a certain atmosphere, just like we talked about in the desert. We wanted to create a certain atmosphere, and so Gabriel has that ability to artistically kind of link with what the writer is saying. And then I had a ton of ideas for Entering the Desert, where the pictures were, what the pictures were going to be, how they were going to be placed, what opened the book, what closed the book, and so Gabriel was completely able to make all of that happen. And so was David Herreras, the amazing artist. I worked closely with him about certain ideas and colors and tones and images. And so then we all kind of worked together to create that, to birth that. And that, to me, was a real alchemical act as well. So I think Anathema just cares about its writers, and then Gabriel has an alchemical vision that he can kind of put his vision into a way to let some type of alembic, and it comes to life in a very nuanced way. It seems transparent, but it's not. It's amazing. So I'm very honored to be with Anathema. It's an honor to be there, and I'm just blown away by how much they help me, you know, make my vision come to life. And so it's wonderful experience. I look forward to many more books with them.
What are like the 2 or 3 really big pieces of advice that you might have for someone just starting out on the esoteric / spiritual path? Is it kind of like just do it? Is it make sure to have perseverance? I mean, what are like the 2 or 3 big things that you would want them to know?
I think the number one thing would be to seek out a mentor. You know, if you have a certain subject which you find interest in, try to find people that have been, you know, educated and or practice in that system for quite a long time. And that doesn't mean that they have to be some published expert. It could be just someone who's been doing it for a long time. You know, find someone who's been experienced in that subject matter, talk to them, try to find someone who can kind of help you through that, just to give you advice. And number 2 is educate yourself. You know, find as much information about the subject as you can. Consider that the education on that subject is going to be a lifelong thing. And then the 3rd thing would be just be patient and learn to live life with passion. That, you know, life is something which is meant to be lived with passion and intensity. Don't see your spiritual practice as something which is disconnected from your life in the world. See it with something which should help your everyday life become more fulfilling and more inspiring. To me, the ultimate, at the end of the day, we have to be inspired. And many things inspire me, from books to music to art to my physical practices of things, but my friendships, conversations inspire me. Foods, experiences of things inspire me. Sensual immersion in the world, meaning that just the smells, sights, and sounds of life inspire me. And so I think people need just to remember to be creative and be inspired, and that's going to take them a long way.
Can you share a little bit about not only the upcoming projects that you've touched on, Tantric Physics Volume 2 coming out, but also where can people find you online, resources, things like that?
Yeah, then they can definitely go to my website, which is ayurvedaaustin.com, and I have a blog called Transmissions from the Kali Yuga, which is on WordPress, which they can easily find that via my website. Of course, on social media, I always post my blog post on Facebook and Instagram, the usual things. I don't have a problem, although I often have been a critic of technology. I think technology is only a problem if we don't use it the right way. And so I try to use technology in an inspiring way and to get basically just to get information out. That's what I see as the most important thing. So I'm pretty open. People can find me easily, for better or for worse, for that. So, I'll have, 2018 will be a busy year of books coming out, and, constantly writing articles and things like that too. So lots of stuff to put out, lots of stuff to write, and not enough time.
Isn't that always the case? Well, Craig Williams, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the podcast. And of course, we really look forward to having you back on in the future, for sure.
Oh, it's been such an honor, Alexander. Thank you so much for your really penetrating, intelligent questions, and thanks for taking the time to read the book. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Glitch Bottle Podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night, or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and subscribe and download free episodes anytime on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and on Spreaker.com. Just search Glitch Bottle and enjoy. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Glitch Bottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.